Something flickered there in the chat.
Check it now.
Reload.
But I used to see the people making comments. I could see it.
Yeah, we want to.
Sorry guys, this is a little still not happening.
Is it up?
No. Yeah, maybe just.
So I'm going to keep going, okay?
No. Go out. Go to his channel.
Yeah.
The other thing about figures...
No, wait 1 second.
Oh, I'm not allowed to talk either. Oh, there's a comment. Hey, there we go. We are up.
All right.
Comments are happening. Oh,
Hooray,
thank goodness.
hallelujah.
Hello. I don't know if we're getting... Are we getting comments live or are they like lagged from the beginning?
Let's see.
Robert, would these be lagged from the beginning?
No.
These are
No.
now live. Good morning.
Oh,
Okay, we're
thank
up
you,
and running.
Jane.
Thank you so much for being patient on that. As I said at the beginning, this is so many layers of complexity beyond my pay grade, I got to say. So anyway,
Yes,
now I
yes.
feel like you're here. Now it feels live and
There
real.
we go.
I was
Hello,
feeling a
everyone.
little like I was wailing in the wilderness there.
Wow, this is so cool.
So I'm going to continue now. So the idea is that the question that came was, how do you put figures in the landscape? Because there's a sense like, well, their point was, when I put a figure in the landscape, what I feel is the figure needs to be really defined. And the point is, in the same sense of like artistic logic, you want the quality of the painting of the figure to match the quality of the rest of the painting. The tendency is like, oh, it's a figure, I gotta make it look like a figure, until it's overpainted compared to the rest of the painting. So the whole thing is just, if you have a figure, just make sure it kind of fits in with the logic of the rest of the painting in terms of how finished it is. Not tighter or feeling you need to be more dense about it. Now, Brian had a comment about how to darken the colors in his painting. And here's the thing that I have on my palette, phthalo green and alizarin crimson. And if you mix them in relatively equal proportions, not by weight, but just get them, it comes to a chromatic black. But the point is, when you're mixing them, very seldom do you actually hit that chromatic black point. You can have it go this way to be a very, very dark green, or this way to be a very, very dark red. And so that forms the basis then for darkening colors. Now I'm talking about real shadow colors here, not just sort of mixing it with everything. And then there's sort of another one of dioxazine purple mixed with green, say, can be good for shadows where there's still a fair amount of light bouncing back into it. But what I wanted to do is spend a moment just looking at the color wheel, or at color in general, because here, let me show you something. There's a color wheel, right? And we've all seen a color wheel, and we know, oh, I see, there's, the different colors. But here's what I want to show you, because it's kind of intriguing. The color wheel, let's take it, so we're looking at the color wheel like, how do I do this on, like, God dang it. There, we're looking at it. Oh man, I can't do it. But this is the color wheel. And normally we think, oh, this is the color wheel. On the outside of it are our pure pigments, right? And in the middle, if we mix them all together, in principle, we get a mid-gray. And that's the way we normally think of the color wheel. But in fact, it's not a color wheel. It's a color cylinder. Because what you have running down through the middle of the color wheel is the grayscale, from black to white. So if you're looking at the colors, yellow is much lighter than blue. So in fact, if you're looking at a color wheel, it actually does something about like that, right? So that the yellow, because it's lighter, is coming up here closer to the white, and the purples and the blues, say, are much darker, closer to black, and they're coming here. let me see if I have this as the next slide. Okay, so there's the color wheel. It's just what I drew. And it has all the numbers of Y and so on. But you see, there's what we're normally thinking of the color wheel. There's what it's actually doing in three-dimensional space in terms of the relative difference between white and black. And so there's a palette. There's yellow. There's red. You can see it's darker than the yellow. You can see the alizarin's much darker than the yellow. You can see the blue is like, whoa, okay, that's almost black. You can't tell the color now, right? So that whole thing of the color wheel and how you mix light and dark and how you're orchestrating color around that color wheel. I mean, color is a complicated thing. I mean, there's no question. Now, Janet, I'm moving on here. Are there any questions? People coming in? I don't see the chat anymore. No. I'm in the middle of this there. I'm in the middle of a question, but I don't see the chat anymore. Is there still a chat going?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there's still
Excellent.
a chat.
So I don't see the chat, Robert. Not that I need to, really. It's kind of distracting. It's like those news people where they're able to kind of talk and listen and read all at the same time. I don't know how they do it. So Janet had a question about using a script brush. A script brush is like a long brush, you know, sort of like a watercolor brush with quite long hairs on them, but more for like thin lines. And she's saying for painting tall grasses. And she says she can't get enough paint on it, and she has to use solvent, and then it's too thin to do the job. So I might even have mentioned this last week, but I wanted to show you an example of a painter that's done it. So my suggestion is figure out the color and mix a big wad of it, so you've got lots of paint, with another brush, a big wide painting brush, and then drag the script brush through the thick thing of paint, right? No thinner, and then just drag it down where you want it to go, and then load it up again and drag it down where you want to go. So look at this painting by Patrick George. I love this painting. It's such an unusual thing, these foreground grasses. But the reason I wanted to show it to you is, aside from just the great design, look at the number of actual strokes that are taken in that foreground line of individual light grasses to make that work. You realize he's scrubbed this light color into the darker green color with some other ochres and things. And then you could almost count 20 strokes that are actually doing the job of saying these are tall grasses. The rest is all implied. They're implied along the back edge of the triangle. They're implied over on the far left of the triangle, but right up close in the foreground, that whole bottom right is not individual marks so much as just kind of, well, you know, it's not pulling individual lines of white. It's kind of a vertical bunch of colors. But right there in kind of the middle bottom, there's maybe, I'm going to say 20 or so marks that are actually doing the job of all that stuff. And it's a really good reminder that you don't need a ton of detail to give us detail. And Suzanne had a question that back to me.
Oh, did you want to, someone just on that note
Yep.
asked about, do you put an undercolor in before doing a landscape or?
Well, let's look at this. Let's go back to Patrick George's painting. He obviously, well, I'm not saying obviously, but he has painted maybe 2 or 3 layers into that big mass of grasses, the pale ochre grasses, and he's painted several layers of green coming in the bottom left, and he's painted that interplay between the two pretty carefully. And then when that's dry, then he is laying in those few marks that are just dictating the sort of sense of the detail. And Suzanne had a question about getting enough paint on the brush, and she was concerned about like getting it all in the furrow, or just if I just put it on the end, I haven't got enough. I'll just say that when I'm painting, I get masses of paint in there, and I don't worry about paint globbing all over the thing because I just clean it out afterward. If you leave it to dry up there in the furrow, or however you pronounce it, ferrule. Sorry, thank you, Ann. Then you're toast. You'll never get it back out. But if you get it out, while you're still using the brush, you don't have to worry about just clogging the brush with paint, because that's how you get enough to be painterly. You can't just get a little bit of paint on the end and put it in there. You get glob of paint on there, and you kind of twist the brush as you go. So it's like you've got lots of fresh paint, within reason. And then these were just a couple of quick questions. Leslie was asking about large paintings, how, like if she's working on water or clouds, the paint just stays sticky for a long time, and it takes a long time before she can get back to it. And I find, for the most part, in my studio here anyway, the paint's usually dry in a couple of days. If it's really thick towards the end of a painting, not a smaller painting, but if it's got those things may take a few days to dry. But the first coat doesn't take very long to dry. And the thing is that I find is that I try to finish areas. I mean, I do the block-ins fairly quickly, but I would say, Leslie, take an area, like say the whole sky area or the whole water area or clouds or whatever it is, and just focus on making sure you get enough done today so that you can leave it and work on other parts for a couple of days, so that by the time you want to put a second layer on this, you can come back to it. Rather than painting in different places and then come back the next day and it's sticky, you can work on other things and let that dry for a couple of days if you need to. Now, I need to get a new piece of paper here, because Jim was asking me a question about, thank you, Robert, blended edges. And this is a really good question, because blended edges as opposed to sharp edges. So I want to draw something here. If you look at the hardest edge you can get in a painting, right? Let's just take this as a dark and a light. I'm going to emphasize this edge particularly. That's pretty much the hardest edge, the sharpest edge. We're going to assume all this is dark too. But look at this. Supposing you do an edge just as hard, but this side is this value, and this side is this value. Well, it's just as hard an edge, but we've released it, right? We've released it, and we can release it even more. So it's not that the edge is hard, it's that the contrast between them, that's what grips our attention. And rather than just taking your brush and blending and mushing the paint together, a way more painterly way of doing it is to use what are called transition colors. So you've got one value here, and you've got another color here. Well, okay, I've wrecked this one. I've wrecked this one. Here, let's do this. So let's say we've got this, and we've got an edge like this, and for what we want, that edge is a little bit too strong. So rather than taking your brush and going like this, what you do is this color, this is this color, and you would paint them right up to here, and then you lay in a transition color right there. That's the color halfway between these two. Now that could be value, it could be the hue shift, it could be the intensity shift. I mean, that's going to be any color on anywhere that you could possibly mix, because whatever this is, whatever that is, it's halfway between them. But then you get a mark of paint that describes that shift, instead of just mushing things to sort of try to get rid of edges. You stop and you try to figure those colors. That's when you see a really good painter. It's just painterly like this. They're laying things in, and rather than just blending edges and softening everything like that, they're finding colors between things and putting them in. And so it stays looking painterly. And you might say, well, oh my God, what do I do? How do I do that? Well, it gets back to this idea of deliberate practice. You you're isolating other, like rather than all the magnificent and wonderful things you got to think about when you're painting, particularly alla prima, you're going to isolate, say, a particular idea. And you're going to say, I'm going to put two colors of relative amount of shift, and I'm going to just practice finding a color that if I put it right down the middle is going to allow me to soften that edge with paint instead of blurring, just blurring it. And you just practice that with a series of colors. It's just like, practicing your backhand or something if you're playing tennis rather than just playing a match. I mean, you sort of work on the parts where there's weak bits. Now, Carol and Bonnie were both asking a question about the need for high contrast and lost edges. And they'd heard that, you really need to have high contrast and lost edges in a good painting. And in some ways, there's truth to that. But as a rule or a piece of advice that you've got to kind of put in your head, and you get all these things, you take lessons and you get all these ideas in your head and you're trying to take like 20 of them and apply them as you're working. It's one of those things of like putting techniques over principles. The more you can understand the principles underneath them, then the easier it is to sort of implement them. So it's maybe true, but you could think of lots of examples where it wouldn't be the case. But the high contrast, like I was just saying, the high contrast is what creates the edge, that thing that says. So let me show you a couple of slides here of, there's an Andrew Wyeth. Now, I would say those are hard edges and lost edges. If you look at those two vertical things there, you can see down in the bottom left of the right-hand one, the dark one, the edge is lost, right? And on the other one, you can sort of see in the middle part on the left-hand side, again, there's sort of parts that are lost. But really hard, crisp edges, tonal painting, beautiful painting. I love this painting. I love this painting because it's just inspirational to me that he was sitting there and thinking, oh my God, look at that. Just think it's fantastic. But look at this painting by Twachtman. He's sort of known as I guess he's definitely known as a tonalist. But, there's some darks right there in the foreground against the light water. But look at how soft so much of that painting is. You don't have to have these high contrast paintings. That's a very moody painting. It gives us a sense of what the mood was at that particular time. And so, we're drawn to the beauty of it because we've been in places that are kind of misty and like that, Is there a question?
Well, yes, okay, so
I want to answer
there
your
are
questions
some.
too.
Okay, two questions. Melody asked, do you use medium for the first coat when you started painting? And the second one was someone asked about chromatic black. Do you ever use that? So people are asking about shadows, do you use any formula for shadow colors?
Okay, great questions. Thanks, Ann. So in terms of medium, if I'm doing a smaller painting like 8x10, I don't use any medium. I like getting thick paint and just pushing it in there and having it painterly. I like the quality of paint mixing with paint. In fact, Tuesday's video is on alla prima painting, and I'm just pushing paint into paint. I'm sort of trying to explain that. But if I'm doing a larger painting, say 24x24 or 36x36, then I'll mix a little Gamsol, which is just a really odorless mineral spirits, just enough so that it goes on quite easily with, here, one of these brushes. With one of these chip brushes, you get them for like I'm going in the wrong direction. You get them for like $2 at the hardware store. And I use 1 inch and 1.5 inch, those things. And, the first time you use them, they're sort of there's hairs like falling all over the canvas and you have to pull them out. But they're very good just for like getting big loose areas in and just a little bit of mineral spirits. So the paint is still really dense, but it's going on quite easily. And then as I say, that only takes, well, sometimes overnight, but certainly 2 days, that's dry. And then I can go back in with a second coat. And then in terms of chromatic black, I was mentioning earlier that phthalo green and alizarin crimson will give you a chromatic black. Not the only chromatic black, I mean, you can buy tubes of chromatic black, and I guess they probably might mix purple and other things with it, but they can't mix too much from the light end of the spectrum, you know, the yellows and the ochres and so on, to counterbalance the purple, because that'll lighten the whole mixture and you want it to be basically black. So a chromatic black, I think very often might be phthalo green and alizarin crimson, and you can probably just make it yourself. But the advantage to not using chromatic black out of a tube is that you're going to be inaccurate in your mixture of the phthalo green and the alizarin, and that's to your advantage. You're shifting your black around. Because the problem with using black is not that, I mean, I use black in interiors and things, in still lifes I'll use black. I don't want to use it much in landscapes. But in interiors where you really get some really darks, I'll use black. I just use ivory black. But the point is, if you're not careful and you start mixing black with each of your colors to make it darker, then the whole painting starts to take on a kind of gray, it just goes gray. It's like if you just mix white with all your colors, it just sort of goes chalky. And so I find that the less you use black, the more you're forced to kind of use colors to find arrangements and ideas. The black, you know, is a recipe really for lazy mixing. If you really know how to use it, it's not. But if you're not careful, it just starts to creep into too many colors, and then before you know it, the whole thing's starting to go gray.
Another question.
Yeah.
Tissa asks, are shadows always cool?
Okay, are shadows always cool? So, no, they're not. It sort of works that if you're outdoors in the sunshine, painting plein air, the light is always warm, right? The sun is warm. If it's overcast, still bright, but overcast, that warmth is grayed out by the cloud, but still, generally speaking, it's warm. And particularly in sunshine, the shadows are always warm, or always cool if the sunlight's warm, shadow cool. Now, if you have a studio with a north light, you can set up a still life, and you've got cool light coming in the studio window from the north, right? There's no sunshine, that's to the south. And you'll find that the shadows are warm. Cool light, warm shadow. Much, much, much less apparent than the warmth and coolness of sunshine. You just need to go out I have a couple of slides later on of painting white, how to paint white. And I've got two paintings of snow, and there's you know, if you've been out in snow in the evening light, long orange light of the sun, you can see the sun's orange, the light's orange, where the sun's hitting, the shadows are blue. It's really obvious. And the point is, if you overlay local colors on that, like a field of green grass, they're also warm and cool, but because it's green, it hides it from our mind. We think, oh, it's just green. But it's just that same warm, cool shift that's going on.
But along those lines, just to ask also, you know, is it a consistent that it would be across the color wheel? If sunlight is on one side, the shadows are consistently across the color wheel in the complement.
Okay, so now that's a good question. So let's say the sun's shining. Let's just take the example of outdoor sunshine because it's easy. You've got the sun shining, and you imagine taking a big sheet of plywood and painting it all the colors of the rainbow, red and yellow and green and blue, like that. And then you put a big thing to shadow half of it. So if you're just looking at it, it's all just red stripes of red, yellow, green, blue, and now half of it's in shadow. So the shift between the lit side and the shadow side in both temperature and value is constant between all of them. Does that make sense? So that as it goes from lit to dark, it's the same, let's say, 3 steps on the grayscale, and it's the same shift in temperature, whatever that is, same shift all the way down. I mean, if something were reflective, it might change it a little bit, but basically it's consistent all the time, all the time. And that's what gives us this sense of light and dark and them working together in concert in the painting. And then Christine had a question about, is a painting bad because it's pretty? And I thought this was a great question because, you know, you could look at children's book illustrators, and some of them are just fantastically great. And in many respects, a lot of them are pretty, and they're kind, and they're beautiful. Some of them are beautiful paintings. And I would never argue with it in a moment as to whether it's good art or not. But then you get into this whole thing of taste, you know, really. And I was just reading an article about this new documentary that came out called Listening to Kenny G, who's this guy that plays this kind of soft jazz. And he's insanely successful. I mean, he's sold 75 million records. And jazz musicians hate him because he's just kind of sweet and saccharine. But the public obviously likes him. And it reminds me of Thomas Kincaid, you know, who's passed away now. But his company was traded on the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, the guy was a marketing genius. But if you talk to a good painter about his paintings, most of them were like, wow. But the public, some buying public, obviously loved him. So that's a question of taste. And are we in a position, you know, I mean, why would you want to be snooty about it not being any good? I mean, obviously Kenny G can play saxophone and Thomas Kincaid could paint. But, you know, what we're actually trying to do with our art and how we're trying to do it, you could imagine a scene of Venice, say, and you've got someone painting it and they've got gondolas and they've got little cafes with people sipping their wine and every single window has a flower box in it. And, you know, it's just kind of bad, really. It's too saccharine to really be a good painting, probably. They're trying too hard. Because I'll tell you, one of the best paintings I ever saw was a painting of a wheelbarrow full of limbs. And the limbs were old and gray. And it was horrific. But it was one of the most beautiful paintings I'd ever seen. And I can't explain that. The subject matter was terrible. The painting was beautiful. So there's a wonderful quote. Let me just read this to you. I'm not going to read you masses of poetry. I just want to read you one thing about this idea of taste and how we find it. Mary Oliver, she died a couple of years ago. She's this lovely poet, has all these great quotes in her poems. But it's just 2 lines. It says, I look morning to night. I am never done with looking. Looking, I mean, not just standing around, but standing around as though with your arms wide open. And that's kind of the spirit of making art, isn't it? We're just open to what is there in front of us and making it work. Miriam had a question about the composition of portraits. And I just wanted to show you some slides to give some ideas on that, because it's kind of interesting here. This is a painting by Van Dyck, and it's quite small. I've seen it. It's only, as I remember it, sort of, 13 inches by 10 inches or something. And he was living in Antwerp. He'd been Rubens' studio assistant for years and years and years, and was ready to go out on his own. And he thought the place to go was the court of England. So he did this painting before he left as like, okay, this is what I can do. Now, if you were interested in getting your portrait done and you saw this portrait, I would go anyway, this guy knows what he's doing. I mean, it's an incredibly good portrait. As a composition, well, we're just drawn to the middle of the head. He's not really thinking about composition. But this is a fairly typical relationship in the way compositions work around the head. If you'll notice that the lit side of the head, it's darker behind the lit side, popping that edge forward. Not forward so much that it comes ahead of the nose, but that it allows us to pay our attention to the left-hand side of the painting. And then the background on the right-hand side is lighter than the background of the head, of the back of the head. So it's all, if you look at a bunch of Renaissance portraits, unless it's jet black everywhere, they're always playing that background so that the lit side is darker and the dark side is a little lighter. But again, when you look at this, you obviously look at the face. Most portraits, you're going to look at the face because that's sort of why you're doing it. Not a figure where the person might be turned away from you. But there's a beautiful kind of pull up the back of the figure and around the head and that gorgeous blue material. But everything is subservient to that head. But then you look at this painting of Fairfield Porter's. I love this painting. I can't tell you. Somebody said to me, it's terrible. They don't know how to paint. Blah, blah, blah. I just think it's like, I love it. You look at how simple, the hair at the top is the same value as the background. The hair is just two values. The face is just two values except for the top of the eye and maybe a hit at the mouth. The jacket is two values. The background, just simple things. But there is a lot of emotion in this painting. I mean, whether he's depressed or thoughtful or we don't know exactly what's on his mind, but certainly there is a feeling here. And I remember somebody saying, there's no tube with emotion in it. You only create emotion by the interplay of the shapes you're using on the picture plane. And you're orchestrating those shapes to bring about something that gives us some emotional reaction.
So to sort of extrapolate on that, someone had a very great question. Neil had a question. Do successful paintings need narrative? And, it sort of begs the question about, do they need narrative that's meaningful to you?
Excuse me. So I think that's a fantastic question, Neil, because there's different kinds of narrative. If you go out and paint a field in sunlight, there's some trees back there and so on. Is there a narrative there? A field of wildflowers and not really, not in the sense of a story. You could say there's a beginning and a middle and end, the way we think of that story. So in terms of that narrative, then there isn't a narrative, is there? But there is a narrative in the manner in which you've painted it. There's a painterly quality to what you're bringing to this, and you want that narrative to be consistent, just like you want a story to be consistent. It doesn't go from science fiction and jump into comedy, let's say. It stays in a certain genre. So if you're painting a landscape, you're wanting the quality of the foreground, the quality of the paint, the quality of all the things to come together in one whole. And that's one narrative whole of how you are painting it. The manner of your brushstrokes, the quality of the color. That is very definitely a narrative. And that narrative is playing whether you're doing a painting like this, right? The quality of the paint, if you look here, there's no place he's tightening up. He's having to get a little tighter in the face, but it doesn't feel like he's getting tighter. The hands are quite loose. The typewriter's pretty loose, right? There's a consistency of narrative expression here that's consistent with, as it happens, the actual narrative of a human being caught in some reverie of some kind. So I hope that answers that question, because it's a great question, because some paintings simply don't have narratives. Here's a painting by a British guy named Sarji Mann. And again, I love this painting. I love the shapes of this figure sitting in that chair. Now, what does she look like? Well, we don't know. I think he's probably painted it once or twice and decided he'd scrape it off, and then he never got around to it again. But it doesn't bother me that there's no face to it. This is like this idea that we were talking about earlier, where you don't make sure that the figure is more defined than the rest of the painting, because in a case like this, most times you would be overworking the face because, it's the face and we have to make it great. And here he's left it out, and the rest of the painting is being carried by the beauty of these different shapes. And then here's one more. And this is in terms of composition. So many, and we can look at the last three paintings, so many portraits have a natural vertical to them, right? I mean, they're either standing there or sitting there. A landscape has the natural horizontal of the horizon line. And so you're having to look for the verticals. Most portraits, if they're sitting in a chair or standing, the natural compositional structure is of a vertical leading us to the face. I mean, it's almost like a given. And we can see an interplay of horizontals and verticals, but they're much easier to come to the interplay, in particular if you get them narrower like this. Even here, we know the horizon is back there someplace, even if it's behind the wall. We know the horizon's out there. And that big swish that goes off his left shoulder onto the right-hand side, I don't know what that is, but it's helping create this sort of connection to the horizontal with the picture plane.
Okay, I guess people can't really hear me, so they're asking you
Oh.
to repeat the question.
Oh,
that
sorry.
I'm asking on, that's my fault. But Greg asked a good question. You used the word painterly, and
Yeah.
can you explain more of what you mean by that?
Okay, so Greg's question on painterly. Let me just hold that for a minute. Let me just see when this is coming up. Okay, let me just hold this because somebody asked me about are there any art movements today, and I just wanted to go through some paintings as things are sort of coming forward. And there's a couple of examples there that perfectly illustrate what painterly means, and it'll be easier to show them to you and describe it then rather than describe it sort of in a bunch of words. Now, the next thing I thought I'd do is, because a number of people have asked me, can you show us some of those drawings on the back wall?
Yay!
And I'm just going to go through. Now, that's a quick thumbnail before making a painting. That was a more detailed drawing, about maybe 8 inches across, before beginning a 72-inch wide painting. So I wanted to make sure I had something that was going to work, and so it was a little bit more finished. There is just a few simple shapes, a few simple masses, and you can see us getting pulled to the back of the river just to the bend there. And if you had that already before you began to paint, you could do all manner of things in all those different shapes in terms of shifting values and nuanced color and painterliness, but at least you'd have a roadmap of where you were going. This was a photograph. I was just looking at 3 different ways I might crop it to sort of get this sense of light coming through. You can see how drawing like this is a really useful sort of way to think about what you're going to do. There's another one. That was before, I might have shown this in one of the YouTube videos. It was a plein air painting I did up in Goleta, up the coast. And I just did that before painting it. And there was a quick sketch of something that became that, but you can see the thinking of what I'm trying to get, and then that's sort of more finished. I did a painting of that somewhere in one of the YouTube videos one week. That's in the town, Le Barou, the town where I used to teach the workshops. But you can see it's just 3 values. And boy, do you ever get a sense of sunlight hitting that, right? Very simple. And there's just a sketch before doing, it was a large 36 by 36 inch still life. And I just wanted to make sure that I had the thing in my mind before beginning. And then these are just a couple of figure drawings that I had that I thought I'd show you. And I think that's it. Because it's useful for clarifying ideas, but the other thing is drawing like that is really meditative. You know, so much of what art is about the quality of our attention. Attention comes from a root meaning to stretch. You know, you're stretching your attention to it. And Mary Oliver has this, again, that poet, has this wonderful quote that attention is the beginning of devotion. And, you know, you can look at your art practice and find ideas embedded in that idea. Like, why are you drawn to this thing? Why do you do it? Well, I don't know why I want to paint. I just know I do. But there is a quality. Devotion sounds a little rich and maybe religious, but there is a quality that is more than just attention. You know, you get pulled into this thing. And there's a wonderful quote by George Sanders, the writer. He's saying craft. And when you think of the word craft, I mean, if I'm doing those drawings, you realize part of it is art, but part of it is craft. You know, art stands on the shoulders of craft, I think Anne Patchett said. So craft, When you think of craft, you think of maybe a woodworker, slowly and methodically, just quietly working things, because you can't rush it. So craft, he says, like prayer, can function as a form of ritual self-expansion. And that's quite similar to the idea of devotion. It's like when you give yourself to this, you're not impulsive and fast, but give yourself to the craft of it. It is like a meditation practice, certainly an attention practice. So now Shraddha had 3 good questions from last week. Are there any art movements today? 2, in the art journey from representational to abstract, can you just jump? Leave one behind and go to the next. And 3, does art need mystery? And if so, can representational art do that? So let's look at a few paintings. This is a Titian. Now, the main thing, most of the paintings, 15th, 16th, 17th century, were either by the church or mythology. This is Bacchus and Ariadne, Greek myth. And so, complex figure, extraordinarily beautiful painting. But then you take that motivation of the church or the myths to sort of mid-1800 French academic painting. Now, this painting is as beautifully painted as anything you'll ever see. It's by Charles Bargue. Extraordinary painting. But what's it about now, right? It's just sort of a little domestic scene. And and you'll find that if you look at paintings of this period, they start to get sort of more and more moralistic in some ways of like, living good moral lives. And then we get to Impressionism, which wasn't done that much later than the Bargue drawing. But now, this gets back to the idea of painterliness. Look at the last painting. All the brush marks are hidden. You can't see the brush marks. You can get very, very close to that and not see the brush marks. It's beautifully painted, but it is not painterly. Painterly means you're quite aware of the brush marks, but if you're up close, you're really aware of the brush marks. But if you stand back to viewing distance, let's say 8 or 10 feet, the brush marks coalesce into the illusion. And you're still aware of them, but generally speaking, the illusion takes over. So if you look at this, you don't sit here looking at brush marks, you sit here looking at an illusion. But if you actually look at it, you realize, well, there's just brush marks all over this thing. And that is a painterly painting. You want the viewer to engage in the way the painting was actually painted. Now I'm doing this to sort of go from representational to non-representational painting. So this is now 20, 30 years later, Matisse, right? Completely representational. There's nothing in there, you don't know what it is. There's a ceiling, there's some buildings outside, there's a curtain, there's a glass, there's a nude, there's a table, there's a chair, like that. You know what everything is, but it is no longer painted in a very representational way. You're very aware of the paint and the sort of the crudeness of how it's put together. And then you take, say, Paul Klee, another, 20 years later, 10 years later, that's entirely non-representational. It's a beautiful painting, but it's non-representational. All of them, and I'll say this again, all of them are abstract. Because even if we go back to that Charles Bargue, which is that French academic painting where you can't even see the brush marks, it's completely abstract. The world is 3 dimensions, and he's put it on a 2-dimension, abstracted it into 2 dimensions. So this is a completely non-representational painting, one we might also call abstract. But look at this. This is also a representational painting. This is William de Kooning's Woman. Well, it's hardly a woman, but you still recognize a woman. It's still representing something. This is another de Kooning, and it's about 80 by 60, so you can only imagine the size of the brushes he's using in this. That's non-representational. Representational, non-representational. By most people's sort of thing, it's completely and utterly, both of them are abstract, right? And then you take something like Richard Diebenkorn. Again, it's a very abstract painting. There, I don't know how he's painting that, but he's sort of making it up as he goes along, I guess. And Diebenkorn has some kind of structure he's holding to. You know, I mean, it changes. He's got lines in here, the little diagonals here and there that he's painted over. He keeps working and reworking it, but he's sort of got a structure in mind that allows him to keep functioning. And then Marcel Duchamp's fountain was shown in 1917, I think, or 1915 in a show in New York. There were 50 of the greatest art or best known art curators of the 20th century described this as the most influential artwork of the 20th century, which sort of gets back to the question of Schroeder had, is are there any art movements today? And all I can say is this one pretty much left everything in the dust, right? I mean, we now have a postmodern. Like if you look at paintings, modernism was the idea that let's say you have Impressionism, and then you have post-Impressionism. That's a step towards modernism. And then you have Fauvism. That's a step. Everything seemed to be sort of, this is historically, after the fact, moving towards something. And then Clement Greenberg with the abstract expressionists is sort of saying flatter, 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 until it's like there's nothing left. And Duchamp, you know, had sort of done that much earlier, 1917, had done that much earlier with saying, well, anything you want. If I'm calling it art, it's art. So if you were to go to Art Basel Miami, which I think is over now, but it was just on last week, you would walk through rooms and rooms and rooms and galleries and galleries and galleries of stuff that is thoroughly perplexing. And unless somebody gives you a fairly intellectually concise description of what's going on, most of it you'll have no idea. So I don't know what to say about it, because I'm a bit of a Philistine in a way. There's certainly some contemporary artists that are fascinating and interesting and doing wonderful work, and painters also. But it's a big, messy field with a lot of money poured into it, because there's a lot of people that are looking for ways to invest money, you know, the real estate, the stocks. What about the art market? And so it's an odd field, actually. And I don't spend a lot of time looking at it because I don't really understand it, to be honest with you.
So people are wanting to know.
Whoa, we've been an hour.
I know. So there's a couple questions. People are wanting to know your book.
Oh, Mary Oliver. Well, this is like a selection of her poems all through her life. But I think if you were to get some poems, maybe from the library, you would not be unhappy. And can you get me a creative authenticity for you?
Yeah.
And then here, let me just say that it's now been an hour, and I don't really want to go.
Couple more questions.
Okay.
I want to squeeze in because.
And then here is this idea of mystery. This is a Rembrandt etching, and I don't know what it is. It's Goethe. It's Goethe talking with, or looking, you know, who knows what that is. And this is a drawing by Seurat, and I think there's a ton of mystery to that drawing. It's so simple, but it really gives us a lot of information. So then there were still some questions here. I still haven't got. Sharon had a question about symmetry in old master paintings, and
so many questions.
Palatine when is a painting finished? Listen, I'm going to go to that one, and Joni's question about light, because.
Okay. But I'm not letting you finish without asking.
Oh, okay. No, please,
questions.
Anne, please, questions.
Okay. Marcia asked, do you put the color of the light into your color? So if you think the light is orangish, are you putting the color of the sunlight into your
that's I'll tell you something. Joni, is it? Marcia.
No, Marcia.
Marcia, I have to tell you, that's the greatest question, because I remember I took color theory at art college. We spent a whole year on Johannes Itten's the theory of color. All the exercises in that thing. I knew all theoretically. We did exercises, everything, all the different contrasts. I knew all about color. You know, I'm joking, because I remember, in theory, I knew everything about it. I remember going out, and I was in my last year of art college. I was in Florence, and I was painting landscapes. It was late in the afternoon, and there was this beautiful, warm orange light hitting the green tree. And I was absolutely flummoxed about how to paint it. I just had no idea. And I had all the theory in the world. I simply didn't know how to do it. So I mixed some green, to your point, and I mixed some orange because one's green, one's orange, and danged if that wasn't right. It worked. So in that respect, you have, in the shadows, you have light, in outdoors again, you have the blue sky bouncing into the shadows and making them blue, and you have the warm sunlight hitting wherever the sunlight is hitting, and they do create that shift, and you need the blue and you need the yellow or the orange or whatever, just depending on the time of the day, in order to get that sense of color. You do that exactly.
Okay,
Another
guys,
one?
people can't hear me, I guess,
Okay,
so I'm just
just
gonna
come here.
scooch in.
Yeah.
Just the last two questions, people were asking about, if you're teaching again, and then also the other thing was, Lorraine, I think it was Lorraine, asked about if you, when you're working on an interior, do you work back to front?
Okay,
painting?
great, thanks, Ann. So 2 questions. One about teaching again. I am teaching again. I developed some online courses about 3 years ago, and I taught them, and I haven't taught them in over a year now, but I'm gonna teach them again in early February, and one of the YouTube videos around the middle or the 3rd week of January, I'm going to explain the whole thing of what the online courses are. And, I hope some of you find that whole idea really interesting. And what was the last one? Interiors, going from back to front. Here's the thing about going from back to front. And I talk about a little bit this week in the Alla Prima thing. What's useful in a landscape, and I know you're mentioning interiors, but in what's useful in a landscape is if you have, let's say, the sky color, and you put that in first, and then you want to put a tree here in front of it. Yes, tree here in front of it. I can put a mark of paint here that goes up into the blue, and I never need to touch it again. If I paint the tree in first and put that nice mark of, say, the branch going up into the sky, but I haven't painted the sky in, then I have to paint the sky in and I'll lose the mark and I'll have to try to put it in again. So one of the things about Alla Prima painting is you tend to put this mark in front of something that's already painted, because then you can just leave it. So that could apply in some situations in an interior, because in many cases you've got, walls meeting walls maybe, or ceilings and things. You may not find that you've got a plant or something coming up in front of something where it's so important to just put in that mark and to leave it. So it might not be so important to the actual sequence of how you'd paint it. But I would say, in principle, if you know that you're going to be putting in marks that you hope are not going to have to be shifted again, then paint the thing in behind it first and then put those marks in afterward. So we've been an hour and 10 minutes. I still have some slides and questions and so on, but I would rather you're feeling like, boy, I'd like to come back again in January. I mean, and again, let me know, is this useful and great and fantastic, and should we do it again? I can't see the chat, so they'll have to tell me afterward, because I'll do it again in January if it seems to make sense.
Yes, and I just want to say thank you, everybody. Lots of people said that next time we'll have a mic so that the questions can be better heard from.
No, I'm really sorry, because I listened to the last one, and Anne was on the far side of the room, and I could hear her like she was on a mic. So I'm a little surprised that it didn't come up this week, and I'm sorry, but we'll definitely have a mic for her next time.
Lots of questions about watercolor, and that, I said next time maybe.
Yes, I think in 2 weeks. I mean, there are lots of people that paint watercolor way better than me in terms of nice, beautiful washes and so on. I use watercolor more like as a sketch medium to understand shapes and so on. I just kind of use it almost like oil paint, but with the dictates of whatever watercolor have. But I think it'll be useful. I'm going to do a demonstration and do it for a Tuesday video, because even if you mainly paint in acrylic or oil, watercolor can be a good sort of sketch medium for sort of getting ideas. And so I'll do that. And for those that are watercolor painters, it's just another way of working, and there'll probably be some interesting ideas there. So
That was so fun.
that was great fun.
Everyone's saying yes, and they're saying thank you, and
Yeah, I really enjoy it. It's fun.
Yes, and you
Yeah,
work
and
so
Ann,
hard.
thank you so much. And Robert, thank you so much. And how do we end this?
Oh yeah, I never even know where to look. I guess you.
No,
were
you have to
there.
look at the
Oh,
light.
Well, that's so nice. People were from all over. It was really so moving that people.
That's great. Well, listen, I have to say, these are fun. It's not so fun when the chat's not working, but it's...
Now we know.
But now we know. So listen, I'll see you... there'll be a video on Tuesday, and I'll continue doing those, and I'll see you in January.
oh, so nice.
Bye for now. Listen, have a great... If I don't talk to you to January, have a fantastic holiday, marvelous New Year, and I'll see you in an artistically vibrant New Year. Bye for now.
Oh, somebody said I would vote for this again, but I'd have to have it. Yes. So.